Before we begin this historical journey, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel for more in-depth historical documentaries, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. The morning mist still clung to the Norman coastline when Major Hans Weber stepped from his concrete bunker at Pointe du Hoc, surveying the seemingly impenetrable fortifications that stretched before him like a grey ribbon along the French coast. For 2 years, Weber and thousands of his fellow German officers had watched as the Atlantic Wall took shape, a testament to Nazi engineering ambition and a symbol of what Adolf Hitler had proclaimed to be an unconquerable fortress. Yet on this June morning in 1944, Weber felt an unease he couldn't quite explain, a gnawing sense that something fundamental was about to change. The Atlantic Wall represented the culmination of one of history's most ambitious defensive projects, conceived in Hitler's mind as an impregnable barrier against Allied invasion. Construction had begun in earnest in March 1942, when Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 40, commanding the transformation of Europe's western coastline into a fortress of concrete and steel. The project fell under the control of Organization Todt, the massive construction enterprise that had previously built Germany's Autobahn network and the Siegfried Line. Under the leadership of Fritz Todt, and later Albert Speer, following Todt's mysterious death in February 1942, the organization mobilized nearly 300,000 workers by May 1944, including volunteers, conscripted laborers, and prisoners of war from across occupied Europe. From the fjords of Norway to the Spanish border, the wall stretched across 2,400 miles of coastline, representing Hitler's vision of Fortress Europe. The fortifications included massive coastal artillery batteries, housing guns capable of engaging ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles, reinforced concrete bunkers designed to withstand direct hits from naval bombardment, and elaborate obstacle systems intended to channel any invasion force into predetermined killing zones. At strategic points along the Norman coast, engineers had positioned formidable gun batteries like those at Long-sur-Mer, where 4 150mm naval guns commanded sweeping fields of fire across the English Channel. The German military hierarchy viewed the Atlantic Wall through different strategic lenses, creating tensions that would prove crucial in the coming months. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group West, represented the traditional German military approach of elastic defense. Von Rundstedt believed in allowing an enemy to establish a beachhead before launching devastating counterattacks with mobile armored reserves, a strategy that had served Germany well in previous campaigns. His philosophy centered on the premise that no coastal fortification, however formidable, could withstand the concentrated power of a determined invasion force. In stark contrast stood Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had been appointed by Hitler in January 1944 to command Army Group B, responsible for defending northern France and the Low Countries. Rommel's experience in North Africa had taught him harsh lessons about Allied material superiority and air power. He believed passionately that any invasion must be defeated on the beaches themselves, in what he termed the longest day. Rommel understood that once Allied forces established a secure foothold on European soil, their overwhelming advantage in men, materials, and air support would make dislodging them virtually impossible. The philosophical divide between these two field marshals extended beyond mere tactical considerations to encompass the very nature of modern warfare. Rommel had witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of Allied air power in North Africa, where German armored formations had been systematically destroyed by waves of fighter bombers operating with near impunity. He recognized that the rapid movement of armored reserves, a cornerstone of German military doctrine, would be impossible under the umbrella of Allied air supremacy that would inevitably accompany any invasion attempt. Throughout the spring of 1944, Rommel had thrown himself into strengthening the Norman defences with characteristic energy and attention to detail. He ordered the installation of millions of mines along likely landing beaches, the construction of underwater obstacles designed to tear apart landing craft at high tide, and the creation of inland flooding that would channel airborne forces into prepared defensive positions. His inspections of the coastal fortifications were legendary among German soldiers, who dubbed him the man who never sleeps for his relentless attention to defensive preparations. Yet even as Rommel worked tirelessly to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, he remained acutely aware of its fundamental weaknesses. Construction remained incomplete in many sectors, with some areas only 18% finished by early 1944. The quality of German divisions assigned to coastal defense had deteriorated significantly as veteran units were transferred to the Eastern Front, leaving behind static formations composed largely of older soldiers, foreign volunteers, and recovered wounded. These divisions lacked the mobility, training, and equipment necessary to conduct effective defensive operations against a modern amphibious assault. The German intelligence apparatus, once the envy of the world, had been systematically degraded by years of war and the loss of critical assets. German weather forecasting capabilities had been severely compromised by the loss of weather stations in the Atlantic and Greenland, leaving meteorologists unable to provide accurate long-range predictions. This intelligence blindness would prove particularly crucial as June 1944 approached, when German forecasters failed to detect the brief weather window that would allow the Allies to launch their invasion. Communication systems throughout the Atlantic Wall reflected the patchwork nature of German defensive preparations. While some sectors boasted modern telephone and radio networks, others relied on outdated equipment that would fail under the stress of sustained bombardment. The complexity of the German command structure, with overlapping jurisdictions between Army, Navy, and Air Force units, created additional layers of confusion that would prove catastrophic when rapid decision-making became essential. As May 1944 drew to a close, signs of impending invasion became increasingly apparent to German intelligence analysts. Allied air attacks on transportation networks throughout France had intensified dramatically, suggesting preparation for major ground operations. French resistance activity had increased substantially, with coordinated attacks on communication lines and transportation infrastructure. Despite these warning signs, the German High Command remained convinced that any Allied invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais area, where the English Channel was narrowest and the distance to Germany shortest. The deception operations, collectively known as Operation Fortitude, had been masterfully crafted to reinforce German preconceptions about Allied invasion plans. Fictitious army groups commanded by General George Patton appeared to be massing in southeastern England, apparently preparing to assault the Calais region. German intelligence, already compromised by Allied counterintelligence operations, accepted these deceptions as confirmation of their strategic assumptions, leaving Normandy as a secondary concern in German defensive planning. Major Weber, standing in his bunker overlooking what would soon become Omaha Beach, represented thousands of German soldiers who sensed that their long period of preparation was drawing to a close. Despite the impressive fortifications surrounding him, Weber understood the fundamental mathematics of the situation facing Germany in 1944. The Reich was fighting a multi-front war against enemies who possessed overwhelming advantages in industrial production, manpower, and strategic resources. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, could not alter these basic realities of modern warfare. As June 5th dawned grey and stormy along the Norman coast, few German defenders suspected that within hours the greatest amphibious invasion in history would test every aspect of their defensive preparations. The fortress Europe that Hitler had proclaimed invincible was about to face its ultimate challenge, and the men who manned its ramparts would discover whether their years of preparation had been sufficient to repel the approaching storm. June 5th, 1944, a day of deceptive peace. The telephone rang precisely at 800 hours in the headquarters of Army Group B at Château de la Roche-Guyon, its shrill tone cutting through the morning calm that had settled over the Norman countryside. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's capable chief of staff, answered with practiced efficiency, already knowing the nature of the call that would alter the course of history. On the other end of the line, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's voice carried the relaxed tone of a man looking forward to a rare respite from the pressures of command. "Hans, the weather reports remain unfavorable for any major operation," Rommel informed his chief of staff, gazing out at the grey skies over his temporary quarters in Herrlingen, Germany. "I see no reason to cancel my plans. Lucy's birthday deserves proper celebration, and we've purchased those shoes in Paris specifically for the occasion." The Desert Fox had made his decision to travel home to Germany for his wife's birthday on June 6th, a choice that seemed entirely reasonable given the meteorological conditions that made amphibious operations appear impossible. Speidel, a seasoned staff officer who had served with distinction throughout the war, understood the reasoning behind his commander's decision. German meteorologists, working with incomplete weather data due to the loss of Atlantic weather stations, had predicted several more days of storms and high winds that would make any Allied invasion attempt extremely hazardous. The English Channel, notorious for its unpredictable weather patterns, appeared to be living up to its reputation for June storms that could scatter invasion fleets and doom amphibious operations before they began. The atmosphere throughout the German chain of command on June 5th reflected this confidence in nature's protection. Many senior officers had departed their posts for various reasons, creating a command vacuum that would prove catastrophic in the coming hours. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army responsible for defending the Norman coast, was conducting a map exercise at Rennes, far from his operational headquarters. Admiral Theodor Kranke, naval commander for the Western region, had similarly departed for consultations in Bordeaux, leaving the coastal defense network without its senior maritime leadership. The German military's assessment of Allied capabilities and intentions on June 5th was shaped by months of carefully orchestrated deception. Operation Fortitude, the Allied strategic deception plan, had convinced German intelligence that the primary invasion target remained the Pas-de-Calais region, where German forces maintained their strongest defensive positions. The fictitious 1st United States Army Group, apparently commanded by General George Patton and positioned in southeastern England, continued to generate false radio traffic and dummy installations that reinforced German misconceptions about Allied invasion plans. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Parachute Regiment, positioned inland from the Norman beaches, spent June 5th reviewing defensive positions with the calm efficiency of a veteran officer. His paratroopers, among Germany's most elite formations, occupied carefully prepared positions designed to counter Allied airborne operations. Von der Heydte had personally supervised the construction of anti-glider obstacles throughout his sector, confident that German defensive preparations would channel any Allied airborne assault into predetermined killing zones where his experienced troops could destroy them piecemeal. The coastal artillery batteries that formed the backbone of the Atlantic Wall maintained their regular routines on June 5th, unaware that within hours they would face the greatest test in their operational history. At Longue-sur-Mer, the 450mm naval guns underwent their daily maintenance procedures, their crews performing the mechanical rituals that had become second nature after months of preparation. Battery Commander Oberleutnant Zur See Kufferath conducted the evening inspection with his usual attention to detail, satisfied that his position represented one of the strongest points in the entire Atlantic Wall. The Merville Battery, positioned to command the eastern approaches to the invasion beaches, presented a formidable obstacle to any Allied assault. Its 4 100mm guns, protected by thick concrete casemates and surrounded by extensive minefields, had been positioned to engage both naval targets and landing forces. The battery's garrison, composed of experienced artillerymen from the 1716th Artillery Regiment, had spent months perfecting their gunnery procedures and coordination with observation posts along the coast. German radar stations along the Norman coast maintained their vigilant watch on June 5th, their operators scanning the horizons for any sign of unusual Allied activity. The Würzburg and Freya radar installations that dotted the coastline represented Germany's technological response to the threat of surprise attack, providing early warning of approaching aircraft or naval formations. Yet these installations, impressive as they were, operated within significant limitations imposed by their fixed positions and vulnerability to electronic countermeasures that Allied forces had been perfecting for months. Communication networks throughout the German defensive system functioned normally on June 5th, carrying the routine administrative traffic that characterized military organizations in peacetime conditions. Telephone lines connected coastal observation posts with artillery batteries and infantry positions, while radio networks linked mobile units with their higher headquarters. The German signals organization had invested considerable effort in creating redundant communication systems designed to maintain coordination even under heavy bombardment. Yet these networks remained vulnerable to the systematic disruption that Allied forces had been planning for months. The French population throughout Normandy went about their daily routines on June 5th, unaware that liberation was only hours away. In villages like Sainte-Mère-Église and Colleville-sur-Mer, residents conducted business with their German occupiers in the careful manner that had characterized 4 years of occupation. French resistance cells, activated by coded BBC broadcasts in recent days, made final preparations for operations designed to support the coming invasion, yet maintained perfect operational security that prevented German intelligence from detecting the approaching storm. Weather conditions on the evening of June 5th appeared to confirm German assessments of Allied limitations. Heavy clouds obscured the moon that airborne operations would require for navigation, while strong winds and high seas made amphibious landings appear suicidal. German meteorologists, working with limited data from their remaining weather stations, predicted continued storms for several more days, providing what seemed like an impenetrable natural barrier against Allied invasion attempts. The German 15th Army, positioned along the Pas-de-Calais coast, maintained its highest state of readiness on June 5th, convinced that it guarded the most likely invasion target. General Hans von Salmuth's formations represented some of Germany's best remaining units in the West, including several panzer divisions held in strategic reserve. The concentration of German strength in this sector reflected months of Allied deception that had successfully convinced the German High Command that Calais remained the primary objective of any invasion attempt. Panzer Group West, commanded by General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, waited in its positions throughout central France, ready to respond to Allied invasion attempts with the mobile warfare that had brought Germany such success in earlier campaigns. The panzer divisions under Geyer's command represented Germany's primary operational reserve in the West, yet their deployment reflected the ongoing strategic disagreement between Rommel and von Rundstedt about how best to employ armored forces against an amphibious invasion. As darkness fell over Normandy on June 5th, German soldiers in bunkers and trenches along the coast settled into what they expected would be another routine night of defensive vigilance. Sentries took their posts with the mechanical precision of men who had performed these duties countless times, scanning empty horizons for threats that seemed unlikely to materialize given the weather conditions. Machine gun crews test-fired their weapons in the prescribed intervals, ensuring that their fields of fire remained clear and their ammunition supplies adequate for any contingency. The irony of June 5th lay in the fact that German defensive preparations had never been more thorough, yet the defenders remained completely unaware of the massive Allied armada already crossing the English Channel under cover of the very storms that had lulled them into complacency. Thousands of Allied ships, carrying 9 divisions of assault troops and their supporting equipment, navigated through heavy seas toward beaches that German defenders considered temporarily protected by natural forces beyond human control. In his comfortable quarters at Herrlingen, Field Marshal Rommel spent the evening of June 5th in domestic tranquility, enjoying precious time with his wife Lucy as they celebrated her birthday. The gift shoes from Paris lay wrapped on a table, symbols of a normal life that had become increasingly rare for senior German commanders. Neither Rommel nor his wife could have imagined that this peaceful evening represented the last moment of calm before the storm that would ultimately consume the Third Reich. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune, as German forces prepared to face an invasion they believed impossible, while Allied forces approached through conditions that seemed to guarantee German security. June 5, 1944, would be remembered as the day when weather seemed to protect Fortress Europe, yet instead provided the perfect cover for its destruction. Dawn of Terror, June 6, 1944. The first indication that something extraordinary was occurring came not from German observation posts along the Norman coast, but from the nervous chatter of radar operators at stations scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. At 00:30 hours on June 6th, Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, manning the Würzburg radar installation near Cherbourg, noticed unusual echoes appearing on his scope, contacts that seemed too numerous and too coordinated to represent routine Allied air activity. Müller's training told him to report these anomalies immediately, yet the sheer scale of what his equipment was detecting defied comprehension. Herr Hauptmann, I am tracking what appears to be several hundred aircraft approaching from the northwest, Müller reported to his battery commander, his voice betraying uncertainty about information that seemed impossible. The response from headquarters reflected the confusion that would characterize German reactions throughout the early hours of June 6th. Acknowledgement of the report, but no immediate comprehension of its significance. German radar operators had grown accustomed to Allied air activity over France, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the armada now approaching Norman airspace. The first German soldiers to encounter Allied forces directly were not the coastal defenders who had spent years preparing for this moment, but anti-aircraft crews positioned inland to protect transportation networks and military installations. At 00:15 hours, flak batteries near Sainte-Mère-Église opened fire on what appeared to be a massive formation of transport aircraft, their searchlights illuminating hundreds of parachutes descending through the darkness. The sight that greeted German gunners contradicted every assumption about Allied capabilities. This was no small-scale raid, but an airborne invasion of unprecedented scope. Hauptmann Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Parachute Regiment, received his first reports of Allied airborne landings at 00:45 hours, information that immediately revealed the inadequacy of German defensive preparations. "Sir, we have paratroopers landing throughout our sector," reported Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter, his voice tight with the realization that years of training were about to be tested under actual combat conditions. Von der Heydte, a veteran of airborne operations himself, understood immediately that the scale of Allied operations exceeded anything German planners had anticipated. The communication breakdown that would plague German defensive efforts throughout D-Day began almost immediately, as telephone lines severed by Allied bombardment and sabotage operations disrupted the coordination essential for effective resistance. Major Karl Weber, commanding the strongpoint at Pointe du Hoc, found himself increasingly isolated as his connections to higher headquarters failed systematically. "We cannot reach regiment," reported his signals officer, Lieutenant Heinrich Schulz, summing up a problem that would affect German defenders throughout the Norman coast. At 0300 hours, the coastal observation post at Port-en-Bessin reported the first sighting of Allied naval forces, a contact that initially seemed so routine that duty officers logged it without immediate alarm. Gefreiter Wolfgang Hoffmann, scanning the dark waters through his binoculars, initially mistook the Allied fleet for a convoy that had strayed from established shipping lanes. Only when star shells fired to demand identification received no response did Hoffmann realize that he was observing the vanguard of an invasion fleet whose size dwarfed anything German coastal defenders had ever imagined possible. The German Navy's response to these initial contacts demonstrated the weakness of Kriegsmarine forces available to contest an Allied invasion. Admiral Kranke's absence from his headquarters in Bordeaux left naval forces without effective coordination, while the few combat vessels available for immediate response proved woefully inadequate against the Allied armada. The 4th and 5th torpedo boat flotillas, operating from Le Havre and Cherbourg respectively, represented the primary German naval assets capable of engaging invasion forces, yet their combined strength amounted to fewer than 20 vessels against thousands of Allied ships. At 05:15 hours, the Allied naval bombardment commenced with a fury that exceeded every German estimate of Allied capabilities. Battery Commander Oberleutnant Kufferath at Longues-sur-Mer found his position subjected to concentrated fire from multiple Allied battleships, their 14-inch and 16-inch guns delivering shells with devastating accuracy. "The bunker is holding, but we cannot maintain effective return fire," Kufferath reported to his regimental headquarters, describing a situation that would be repeated throughout the Atlantic Wall as German positions came under bombardment that dwarfed their designers' worst-case scenarios. The carefully prepared defensive positions that represented years of German engineering effort began to reveal their fundamental weaknesses under the sustained bombardment that preceded Allied landings. Concrete that had seemed impregnable during construction proved vulnerable to direct hits from heavy naval guns, while communication lines buried deep underground were severed by blast effects that German engineers had not anticipated. The psychological impact on German defenders was perhaps even more devastating than the physical destruction, as soldiers who had been told they occupied impregnable positions watched their fortifications crumble under Allied firepower. General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division responsible for defending Omaha Beach, received fragmented reports throughout the early morning hours that painted a picture of coordinated Allied operations beyond anything German intelligence had predicted. "We are under attack at multiple points simultaneously," reported Oberst Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment, his voice conveying the confusion that gripped German defenders as they struggled to comprehend the scope of Allied operations. The 352nd Division, considered one of Germany's better defensive formations, found itself facing challenges that exceeded its training and preparation. At 06:30 hours, Allied landing craft appeared through the morning mist off the Normandy beaches, presenting German defenders with their first clear view of the invasion force they would face. Machine gunner Heinrich Severloh, positioned in strongpoint WN-72 overlooking Omaha Beach, later described the site as an endless fleet stretching beyond the horizon, conveying the shock experienced by soldiers who had expected to face a limited Allied probe rather than a full-scale invasion. The numerical superiority of Allied forces was immediately apparent to German observers, creating a psychological impact that would affect defensive effectiveness throughout the day. The German response to Allied landings was hampered not only by communication failures and command absence, but by the fundamental mismatch between German defensive doctrine and Allied attack methods. German planners had anticipated defeating an Allied invasion through coordinated counterattacks by mobile reserves, yet the massive scale of Allied operations and their overwhelming air superiority made such responses impossible. Panzer units attempting to move toward the beaches found themselves under constant air attack, their advance slowed to a crawl by Allied fighter bombers that dominated Norman skies. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding LX-Kukskun 4th Corps, responsible for the Norman coastal sector, attempted to coordinate defensive operations from his headquarters at Saint-Lô, yet found himself working with fragmentary information and disrupted communications. "We must determine the Allied main effort and concentrate our reserves accordingly," Marx instructed his staff, yet the reality facing German forces was that Allied operations appeared to be succeeding simultaneously across multiple sectors, making such concentration impossible without abandoning other threatened areas. The Atlantic Wall's coastal batteries, designed to engage Allied naval forces at maximum range, found themselves fighting for survival against bombardment that systematically eliminated German observation posts and fire control systems. Battery positions that had appeared formidable during construction proved vulnerable to coordinated attacks that combined naval gunfire with aerial bombardment, creating destruction levels that exceeded German defensive planning. Gun crews that survived the initial bombardment often found themselves unable to engage effectively due to damaged equipment and severed communication lines. French civilians throughout the invasion area found themselves caught between German defenders and Allied attackers, yet many quickly recognized that liberation was at hand. In villages like Colleville-sur-Mer and Vierzeville-sur-Mer, residents who had endured 4 years of German occupation watched Allied soldiers advance inland, with emotions ranging from joy to disbelief. The presence of French resistance fighters, activated by coded BBC broadcasts, provided immediate support for Allied operations, while denying German forces the local knowledge essential for effective defensive operations. As morning progressed into afternoon on June 6th, German commanders throughout Normandy began to recognize that they faced not a diversionary attack or limited probe, but the main Allied invasion effort. The realization that 4 years of defensive preparation had failed to prevent Allied success created a psychological shock that reverberated throughout the German command structure. Officers who had been confident in their defensive positions found themselves struggling to maintain organized resistance against Allied forces whose capabilities exceeded every German estimate. The absence of senior German commanders during the crucial early hours of the invasion compounded every other problem facing German defenders. Rommel's journey home to Germany for his wife's birthday meant that Army Group B lacked its most experienced and energetic leader precisely when decisive action might have influenced the battle's outcome. General Speidel, capable though he was, lacked the authority to commit strategic reserves or coordinate operations between different service branches, creating paralysis at the highest levels of German command. By nightfall on June the 6th, German forces in Normandy had suffered a strategic defeat whose implications would reshape the entire course of World War II. The Atlantic Wall had been breached at multiple points, Allied forces were firmly established on European soil, and German reserves had proven inadequate to contain the invasion. The longest day, as Rommel had termed the coming invasion, had indeed arrived, but it had brought not German victory, but the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's occupation of Western Europe. The telephone at Adolf Hitler's Berghof mountain retreat remained ominously silent throughout the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, while the greatest invasion in military history unfolded along the Norman coast. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, faced an unprecedented dilemma. His Führer was sleeping, and strict orders prohibited awakening Hitler, except for the gravest emergencies. Yet, as reports filtered in from Normandy describing massive Allied landings, Jodl found himself paralyzed by a command structure that concentrated all meaningful authority in the hands of one man who remained unconscious as his empire began to crumble. The communication chaos that engulfed German forces on D-Day reflected years of organizational dysfunction that had steadily degraded Wehrmacht effectiveness. General Hans Speidel, commanding Army Group B in Rommel's absence, discovered that his authority to respond to the invasion was severely limited by Hitler's insistence on personal control over strategic reserves. "I cannot commit the panzer divisions without express authorization from the Führer," Speidel explained to increasingly desperate commanders requesting armored support, revealing the fatal flaw in German defensive planning that subordinated military necessity to political control. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, positioned as a strategic reserve near Caen, waited throughout the morning for movement orders that would never arrive in time to influence the battle's outcome. Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer, commanding the division's Panzergrenadier Regiment, watched with growing frustration as Allied forces consolidated their beachheads while German armor remained immobilized by bureaucratic paralysis. "We could have been at the coast by 800 hours, Meyer later observed, highlighting the tragic waste of Germany's remaining mobile reserves through command incompetence rather than Allied action. The Panzerlehr Division, considered one of Germany's elite armored formations, began its movement toward Normandy only after receiving authorization at 1400 hours on June 6, nearly 8 hours after Allied landings commenced. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, the division commander, understood immediately that this delay had eliminated any possibility of defeating the invasion on the beaches as Rommel had envisioned. "We are too late," Bayerlein informed his staff, as Allied fighter bombers appeared overhead, beginning the systematic destruction of German armored columns attempting to reach the battlefield. The German communications network, so carefully constructed during the Atlantic Wall's development, began failing systematically under Allied interdiction efforts that had been planned for months. French resistance fighters, activated by BBC-coded messages, severed telephone lines throughout Normandy, while Allied aircraft systematically targeted radio installations and command posts. Major Wilhelm Falli, commanding the 91st Air Landing Division, was killed while rushing to his headquarters when his vehicle was strafed by Allied fighters, symbolizing the breakdown of German command and control throughout the invasion area. Allied air superiority manifested itself not merely through the absence of Luftwaffe fighters, but through the constant presence of Allied aircraft that made German troop movement virtually impossible during daylight hours. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation within immediate striking distance of the beaches, found its advance toward Sword Beach repeatedly disrupted by air attacks that destroyed vehicles and scattered formations. Oberst Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, commanding the division's Panzer Regiment, described the experience as attempting to advance through a continuous thunderstorm of explosives, conveying the helplessness felt by German commanders facing overwhelming Allied air power. The German Navy's response to the Allied invasion demonstrated the complete inadequacy of Kriegsmarine forces remaining in western French ports. Admiral Theodor Kranke, absent from his headquarters during the crucial early hours, returned to find his coastal command in chaos as Allied naval forces systematically eliminated German defensive positions. The few German vessels that attempted to engage the invasion fleet discovered that they faced not merchant ships or lightly escorted convoys, but the full might of the Royal Navy and United States Navy operating in coordinated formation. Battery positions throughout the Atlantic Wall, designed to dominate approaches to potential landing beaches, found themselves targets rather than threats as Allied naval gunnery demonstrated precision that German planners had not anticipated. The Longues-sur-Mer battery, considered one of the strongest positions in the entire defensive system, came under coordinated attack from multiple Allied battleships whose fire control systems allowed accurate engagement at ranges previously thought impossible. Oberleutnant Kufferath, commanding the battery, reported that accurate fire from enemy battleships has made effective return fire impossible, summarizing the experience of German coastal artillery throughout Normandy. The 352nd Infantry Division, positioned to defend what would become Omaha Beach, discovered that its defensive preparations were inadequate against the sustained bombardment and assault techniques employed by Allied forces. General Dietrich Kreis, commanding the division, found his carefully prepared positions subjected to naval gunfire of unprecedented intensity, followed by infantry assaults supported by specialized armor that German defenders had never encountered. "The enemy possesses capabilities we did not anticipate," Kreis reported to Corps headquarters, acknowledging the fundamental intelligence failure that had left German forces unprepared for Allied technical innovations. French civilians throughout the invasion area provided immediate assistance to Allied forces while denying support to German defenders, revealing the complete failure of 4 years of occupation policy to secure local cooperation. In villages like Sainte-Mère-Église and Colville-sur-Mer, French residents guided Allied paratroopers and infantrymen through terrain that German forces had considered familiar, while simultaneously providing intelligence about German defensive positions and troop movements. The moral isolation of German forces became apparent as liberation approached, with even previously cooperative French officials abandoning their posts rather than continue serving the occupation regime. The German intelligence apparatus, once considered among the world's most effective, demonstrated its complete degradation through the failure to detect or anticipate the Allied invasion. General Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Military Intelligence for the Eastern Front, later acknowledged that German intelligence services had been systematically penetrated and manipulated by Allied counterintelligence operations. Operation Fortitude's success in convincing German planners that Normandy represented a diversionary attack while the main invasion would target Calais reflected the thoroughness with which Allied forces had compromised German intelligence networks. The logistical nightmare facing German forces became apparent as Allied air attacks systematically destroyed transportation networks throughout northwestern France. Railway lines that had carried supplies and reinforcements to Atlantic Wall positions found themselves under constant attack, while road networks became death traps for German vehicles attempting movement during daylight hours. General der Infanterie Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, discovered that his ability to reinforce threatened sectors was severely limited by transportation difficulties that Allied air power made insurmountable. As afternoon turned to evening on June 6th, German commanders throughout Normandy began to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. The Atlantic Wall, constructed at enormous cost in materials and labor, had been breached at 5 separate points simultaneously. Allied forces were not merely establishing precarious toeholds that could be eliminated by counterattack, but were methodically expanding their positions while bringing ashore the supplies and reinforcements necessary for sustained operations. General Günther von Kluge, who would soon replace von Rundstedt as commander in the West, later described June 6th as the day when German defensive planning revealed its fundamental misconceptions about Allied capabilities. The assumption that Allied forces could be defeated through prepared positions and mobile counterattacks proved false when confronted with the reality of Allied material superiority, technical innovation, and operational coordination that exceeded every German estimate. The psychological impact of D-Day's success reverberated throughout the German military hierarchy, as officers who had been confident in their defensive preparations faced the reality that their best efforts had proven inadequate. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's post-war assessment that "we never had a chance against such overwhelming force" reflected the growing recognition among German military professionals that the war's outcome had been determined not by tactical considerations, but by the fundamental disparity in national resources and industrial capacity between Germany and its adversaries. As darkness fell over Normandy on June 6th, German forces found themselves facing a strategic situation that differed fundamentally from their pre-invasion assumptions. Instead of conducting mobile counterattacks against isolated beachheads, they were defending static positions against Allied forces possessing secure bases of supply and overwhelming superiority in air and naval support. The initiative had passed irrevocably to Allied forces, and German commanders began the painful process of recognizing that their defensive preparations had failed not through poor execution, but through fundamental misunderstanding of the challenge they faced. Recognition, retreat, and the road to defeat. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's staff car raced through the Norman countryside on the evening of June 6, 1944, its headlights cutting through darkness that now concealed not German defensive positions, but Allied armies firmly established on European soil. The Desert Fox's return from his wife's birthday celebration in Germany had transformed from a routine journey into a desperate race to salvage what remained of German defensive capabilities in France. As his vehicle approached the chateau at La Roche-Guyon, Rommel understood that the strategic situation he would confront bore no resemblance to the defensive plans he had spent months developing. General Hans Speidel's briefing to his returning commander painted a picture of systematic German failure that exceeded the worst-case scenarios envisioned by German planners. "The enemy has established beachheads at 5 separate points along our coast," Speidel reported with the clinical precision of a professional staff officer describing a catastrophe. "Allied forces have penetrated inland to distances of up to 10 kilometers, and our counterattacks have failed to dislodge them from any sector." The numbers Speidel cited, 6 Allied divisions successfully landed, with thousands more troops and massive quantities of equipment continuing to flow across secured beaches, represented the collapse of Germany's Western defensive strategy. The 21st Panzer Division's attack against the British bridgehead between Sword and Juno beaches had achieved tactical surprise but strategic irrelevance. Oberst Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski's Panzer Grenadiers had actually reached the coast near Lyon-sur-Mer, briefly achieving Rommel's goal of throwing invaders back into the sea. Yet this momentary success proved meaningless against the scale of Allied operations, as German forces lacked the strength to exploit their penetration, while Allied reinforcements continued landing under cover of overwhelming naval gunfire support. The communication breakdown that had plagued German forces throughout D-Day continued into the evening, as commanders throughout Normandy struggled to assess their situation with fragmentary information. Major Karl Weber at Pointe du Hoc had maintained his position throughout the day despite repeated Allied assaults, yet found himself increasingly isolated as neighboring strongpoints fell silent. "We can no longer contact regimental headquarters," Weber reported via his last functioning radio, summarizing a command crisis that extended throughout the German defensive system. Hitler's delayed response to the invasion reflected the paralysis that had infected German decision-making at the highest levels. When the Führer finally awakened and received briefings about Allied operations, his initial reaction was disbelief, followed by rage directed at subordinates who had allowed such a disaster to occur. "How could this have happened without our knowledge?" Hitler demanded of General Jodl, revealing the extent to which German intelligence services had been compromised by Allied deception operations. The German Navy's post-action analysis revealed the complete inadequacy of Kriegsmarine forces available to contest Allied naval superiority. Admiral Kranke's few operational vessels had attempted to engage the invasion fleet, but achieved negligible results against Allied naval forces that included multiple battleships, dozens of cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers. The torpedo boat attacks, launched from Le Havre and Cherbourg, had managed to sink only one Allied destroyer while losing several German vessels to Allied defensive fire, demonstrating the hopeless mismatch between German naval capabilities and Allied strength. French resistance activities throughout the invasion area had exceeded German estimates of local capabilities, revealing the extent to which occupation policies had alienated the Norman population. Sabotage operations coordinated with Allied landings had severed communication lines and disrupted transportation networks at precisely the moments when German forces needed them most. Intelligence reports reaching German headquarters described widespread French cooperation with Allied forces, including guides who led paratroopers through terrain that German defenders had considered familiar. The Luftwaffe's absence from Norman skies on D-Day represented perhaps the most dramatic indicator of German strategic defeat. Generaloberst Hugo Sperle, commanding Luftflotte 3, responsible for air operations over northwestern France, could muster fewer than 300 operational aircraft against Allied air forces, numbering in the thousands. German pilots who did manage to reach the invasion area found themselves overwhelmed by Allied fighters operating with fuel and numerical advantages that made effective intervention impossible. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding L-X-4 Corps, responsible for the coastal defense sector, provided Rommel with a sobering assessment of German defensive capabilities following 12 hours of sustained combat. Our positions have been systematically destroyed by naval gunfire of unprecedented accuracy, Marx reported, acknowledging that German defensive planning had underestimated Allied technical capabilities. The concrete fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, designed to withstand conventional artillery bombardment, had proven vulnerable to the heavy naval guns that Allied forces employed with devastating effect. Intelligence assessments reaching German headquarters throughout the evening of June 6th painted a picture of Allied capabilities that exceeded every German estimate. The specialized armor employed by Allied forces, including tanks capable of swimming ashore and vehicles designed to clear minefields, demonstrated technical innovations that German intelligence had failed to detect. The coordination between Allied air, naval, and ground forces revealed a level of operational sophistication that challenged fundamental German assumptions about Allied military competence. The strategic implications of D-Day's success extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Normandy, as German military leaders began to comprehend the broader consequences of Allied victory. General der Infanterie Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, understood that German forces in France now faced a two-front war, with Allied armies advancing from both Normandy and the Mediterranean, while Soviet forces continued their offensive on the Eastern Front. The mathematical impossibility of defending against such coordinated pressure with Germany's diminishing resources became apparent to professional officers who had previously maintained confidence in ultimate German victory. Rommel's evening conference with his staff on June 6th focused not on plans for defeating the Allied invasion, but on damage limitation strategies that might prevent complete collapse of German positions in France. "We must establish defensive lines inland and prepare for a fighting withdrawal," Rommel instructed his subordinates, abandoning the aggressive counterattack doctrine that had characterized German military thinking throughout the war. The admission that German forces could no longer hope to defeat Allied operations, but could only delay their advance, represented a fundamental shift in German strategic thinking. The human cost of D-Day became apparent as casualty reports reached German headquarters throughout the evening. German losses on June 6th were estimated between 4,000 and 9,000 men, representing not merely numbers, but the destruction of experienced units whose replacements would be impossible to provide. More significantly, the psychological impact on surviving German soldiers of witnessing Allied capabilities that exceeded their training and experience created morale problems that would plague German forces throughout the Normandy campaign. Allied deception operations continued to influence German decision-making even after the Normandy invasion had clearly succeeded. Hitler and his staff remained convinced that the Norman landings represented a diversionary attack, with the main Allied invasion still expected at Calais. This strategic misperception prevented the transfer of significant German reserves from the 15th Army to Normandy, ensuring that Allied forces would face minimal reinforcement of German defensive positions during the crucial early days of the campaign. As reports continued to arrive throughout the night of June 6th to 7th, German commanders began to recognize that they had suffered not merely a tactical defeat, but a strategic disaster that would reshape the entire war. The Atlantic Wall, conceived as an impregnable barrier against Allied invasion, had been breached in multiple locations by forces whose capabilities exceeded every German assessment. More fundamentally, the success of Allied operations demonstrated that German defensive planning had been based on false assumptions about both Allied capabilities and the effectiveness of static fortifications against modern combined arms operations. The transformation of German strategy from offensive operations aimed at victory to defensive measures intended to delay defeat became apparent in the orders issued during the nights following D-Day. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's instructions to his subordinate commanders emphasized the establishment of inland defensive lines rather than the immediate counterattacks that German doctrine had traditionally favored. The recognition that German forces could no longer hope to achieve decisive results, but could only attempt to inflict maximum casualties on Allied forces while withdrawing toward Germany, marked the beginning of the final phase of World War II in Western Europe. The morning of June 7th, 1944, dawned clear over Normandy, revealing a landscape transformed by 24 hours of warfare that had altered the course of history. German soldiers emerging from their battered bunkers and hastily prepared defensive positions confronted a reality that contradicted 4 years of propaganda about the invincibility of Fortress Europe. Allied ships continued to arrive off the Norman beaches in seemingly endless succession, while aircraft bearing Allied markings dominated skies that German Air Force had once patrolled with confidence. The personal accounts of German survivors from D-Day reveal not merely tactical failure, but the collapse of a worldview that had sustained Nazi Germany through 5 years of total war. Heinrich Sevelow, the machine gunner who had fired thousands of rounds at Allied forces crossing Omaha Beach, later described the experience as witnessing the end of everything we had been told to believe about German superiority. His words captured the psychological impact of D-Day on German forces, not merely military defeat, but the recognition that their fundamental assumptions about German capabilities and Allied weaknesses had been proven false. Field Marshal Rommel's assessment of the strategic situation, delivered to Hitler in the weeks following D-Day, proved prophetic in its recognition that Germany's western defenses had suffered irreparable damage. The Atlantic Wall has been breached, and we lack the resources to restore effective defensive positions, Rommel informed his Führer, acknowledging what many German commanders had begun to understand, that the initiative had passed permanently to Allied forces whose material advantages made German counterattacks increasingly futile. The broader implications of D-Day's success extended beyond immediate military considerations to encompass the fundamental balance of power in World War II. German forces, already stretched thin by commitments on the Eastern Front, now faced the prospect of sustained offensive operations by Allied armies possessing overwhelming advantages in equipment, supplies, and air support. The two-front war that German strategy had sought to avoid since 1939 had become an unavoidable reality that would consume Germany's remaining military capabilities within less than a year. The French population's response to liberation provided perhaps the most devastating commentary on the failure of German occupation policies throughout Western Europe. Civilians who had endured 4 years of German rule demonstrated through their immediate cooperation with Allied forces that Nazi promises of European unity under German leadership had convinced no one outside Germany itself. The moral isolation of German forces, fighting alone against populations they had claimed to liberate, became apparent as liberation approached and revealed the hollowness of Nazi ideological claims. The technical innovations displayed by Allied forces on D-Day, from amphibious tanks to specialized engineering equipment, demonstrated that German intelligence services had failed fundamentally in their assessment of Allied capabilities. The DUKW amphibious vehicles, DD tanks capable of swimming ashore, and armored vehicles designed specifically for beach assault operations, revealed a level of Allied technical preparation that German planners had neither anticipated nor countered. This intelligence failure reflected broader problems within the German military system that had increasingly substituted ideological assumptions for objective analysis. The command failures that plagued German responses to D-Day illustrated the dysfunction that had infected Nazi Germany's decision-making processes at all levels. Hitler's insistence on personal control over strategic reserves, combined with his physical absence during crucial early hours of the invasion, created paralysis at precisely the moment when decisive action might have influenced the battle's outcome. The bureaucratic obstacles that prevented German commanders from responding effectively to Allied operations demonstrated how political considerations had compromised military effectiveness throughout the Nazi system. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, later observed that D-Day represented the moment when German military professionals finally understood that the war was lost. This recognition, shared by increasing numbers of German officers during the weeks following the Normandy invasion, reflected not merely tactical assessment, but acknowledgement that Germany's strategic position had become hopeless against the combined resources of the Allied coalition. The Atlantic Wall itself, Hitler's monument to German engineering and determination, stood revealed as a massive investment that had failed to achieve its fundamental purpose. The concrete and steel that had consumed enormous resources and labor had provided German forces with strong points that proved vulnerable to sustained bombardment and combined arms assault. More fundamentally, the wall's static nature reflected a defensive mentality that contradicted the mobile warfare doctrine that had brought Germany its early successes. The human cost of German defensive efforts on D-Day extended beyond immediate casualties to encompass the destruction of experienced units whose replacement would prove impossible as Germany's manpower resources approached exhaustion. The 352nd Infantry Division, considered one of Germany's better defensive formations, emerged from June 6th as a shadow of its former strength, while coastal artillery batteries that had represented years of preparation lay silent under Allied occupation. French resistance operations, coordinated with D-Day, demonstrated the extent to which German occupation had failed to secure genuine cooperation from subject populations. The willingness of French civilians to risk their lives supporting Allied operations, despite 4 years of German rule backed by military force, revealed that Nazi ideology had convinced no one of German legitimacy or European unity under German leadership. The moral dimension of the war, so long emphasized by Allied propaganda, became tangible as liberation approached and populations demonstrated their true preferences. The strategic deception operations that had influenced German defensive planning represented perhaps the most sophisticated intelligence achievement of World War II. Operation Fortitude's success in convincing German planners that Normandy represented a diversionary attack, while the main invasion remained targeted at Calais, demonstrated Allied mastery of the intelligence warfare that increasingly dominated modern military operations. German intelligence services, once considered among the world's most effective, had been systematically penetrated and manipulated to serve Allied strategic purposes. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the German soldiers who had manned the Atlantic Wall throughout the previous 4 years faced a new reality. The fortress Europe that Nazi propaganda had proclaimed invincible lay breached at multiple points, while Allied armies continued to expand their footholds on European soil. The longest day, as Rommel had termed the coming invasion, had indeed arrived, but it had brought not German victory, but the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. The fear that had taken over on D-Day would prove prophetic, as German forces discovered that their worst nightmares about Allied capabilities had been, if anything, conservative estimates of the storm that was about to engulf Nazi Germany.